To the news of the day, I'd like to bring in Ralph Reed, who's the founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Mr. Reed, thanks for joining us today on Washington Watch.
Yeah, you bet. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are thrilled to have you, and I'd like you just to very quickly tell us what's your reaction to what happened at the Supreme Court on Friday and what's happening today with the Electoral College.
Well, I'm very disappointed that the Supreme Court did not grant standing to Texas. If they weren't going to take the Texas case, I think it was incumbent upon the High Court to take one of the state-specific cases, whether it was from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Georgia, and deal with some of the substantive issues involving irregularities and outright fraud that occurred in the November 3rd election. Here in Georgia, in my home state, we know that there were people who were registered to vote who were underage and not therefore eligible to vote. There were thousands of them. There were people who voted who were registered to vote in other states. There were people who had died whose votes were counted. And we believe that had a forensic audit been conducted of the signatures that appeared on the absentee ballots that came in at a rate of 6 times the normal number of absentee ballots, that we would have found even greater evidence of malfeasance. So I think it's really unfortunate that given the number of Americans who believe that the election results were tainted by these kinds of fraudulent activities, that the court did not take the case and resolve the issue one way or the other as it did in the case of Bush v. Gore 20 years ago.
What do you make of the way that the court turned down the case? And it was pretty quiet. They didn't say a whole lot about it. What do you read into that? Is this politics? Is it expediency? Is it just not wanting to deal with the backlash? What's your opinion on why the court handled it the way they did?
Well, I mean, I think that, obviously it was an issue of standing with regard to whether or not Texas had a right to object to what had been done in other states. And I think that's an intellectually defensible position to take. I don't agree with it. But if you're not going to take the Texas case based on standing, then at a minimum, in order to have these issues resolved in a court of law, at a minimum, there are legitimate issues that have been raised, including the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania deciding that absentee ballots that arrived after November 3rd could be counted. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito ordered that those ballots be set aside and that they not be included in the vote total. It's still not clear whether they're included or not. There are issues involving absentee ballots in Wisconsin, issues involving absentee ballots and people ineligible to vote who voted in Georgia. To just kick that, sweep that under the rug and not ever have it fully litigated and dealt with, I think is not good for American democracy. Whether or not you think Joe Biden won legitimately or whether or not you think that if these issues had been dealt with, that it would have changed the outcome either in one of the 4 or 5 states or in the entire election, they should have been dealt with. As it is, you've got lots of Americans who don't believe they had their day in court, and that's really unfortunate.
I would agree with that, and I think all but the willfully ignorant can see that there are a lot of problems in the irregular way across state boundaries and jurisdictions that votes are counted. Do you think that all of the attention focused on this issue, regardless of how this ends up resolving itself in 2020, do you think there's an opportunity to get to a place where people, again, across the political spectrum can have confidence in the outcome of our elections?
I can tell you that if we have anything to say about it, yes. I am absolutely confident that in those states where Republican legislatures still have a majority, and that is not only Georgia, but Florida, Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Now, some of those, the last three in particular, currently have Democratic governors. So, you're going to have to manage your way through a veto process, potentially. But I can tell you that I think conservatives and the pro-family movement are going to make sure that this never happens again. We're going to have to make sure that there's much tighter verification procedures. Look, in my state and in many states, you have to show – I just voted. I literally came to do this radio show after having gone and voted early. Early voting began today in Georgia. And when I walked to the voting booth at the Buckhead Library in Atlanta where I vote, I had to show an ID. But if I had mailed in an absentee ballot, I'm not required to show an ID. Now, that might have been one thing when you were having 250,000 votes being cast absentee out of 4 or 5 million. But now we're seeing 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million votes being cast by mail. Why is the standard for ensuring a photo ID so that we know whether or not that person is who they say they are? Why is it looser for a mailed-in ballot than it is for when you vote in person? That needs to be fixed. Signature verification needs to be fixed. There are a lot of things that need to be fixed, and I assure you we're going to do it when these legislatures come back into session in January.
I think you're going to find a lot of agreement for that, and I think you're going to find a lot of support for the idea that it is not logical that the standard for voting would be different depending on whether you mail it in or based on whether you vote in person. Now, because you are in Georgia and you have voted early today, the subtext of all of this presidential election controversy is that there is a runoff ballot or a runoff election taking place in the state of Georgia that will ultimately determine the balance of power in the United States Senate. How do you think the election controversy over election integrity at the national level, at the presidential level, is affecting those races on the ground in Georgia?
Look, I think there's a lot of upset people. We certainly supported the idea of our legislature going into special session in order to fix some of these issues that we're talking about before January 5th. The decision was made by the governor not to do that. So we're going to have to run this election under the current set of laws. But I can tell you this right now. We're going to have 4,000. Let me repeat that. We're going to have 4,000 election observers and poll watchers. We're going to have SWAT teams of election law attorneys, including some of the finest bulldog election law attorneys in the nation, who are going to be pre-positioned in the key counties where there were problems in November and where we have to be concerned about problems in January. My organization, Faith and Freedom Coalition, is encouraging people to volunteer to not only be poll watchers and election observers, but to be poll workers, to actually work at the polling locations and verify the signatures on the absentee ballots. We're filling time slots with people to do that. We know that if we let them, they will steal this election, and we are not going to let them. And we want every Christian voter, every conservative voter in the state of Georgia to know that we're going to make sure that this election's integrity is protected.
And we thank you for doing so. You know, speaking of bulldog attorneys, Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood have both been heard in recent days telling people that the best way to protest the presidential race is not to vote in the U.S. Senate race. Is that a message that you think is penetrating there on the ground in Georgia?
Look, Lynn is a friend of mine. I do not know Sidney Powell, but I do know Lynn Wood. He's a good friend of mine. He's one of the most capable litigators in the country today. And I understand how upset he was. And again, there are a lot of people who are upset. But the way to fix this is to change the law to have an effective ballot security program, an election integrity program, to make sure that we don't get caught flat-footed in January as we were in November. The way to fix it is not to make Chuck Schumer majority leader, to elect two socialists from the state of Georgia who will support the most extreme radical agenda we've ever seen in this country, including packing the Supreme Court, massive tax increases, gutting the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, increased funding for Planned Parenthood and abortion on demand. You don't fix it by electing them to the U.S. Senate.
Ralph Reed, Faith and Freedom Coalition. Last question. You're going to be part of the FRC Action Pray Vote Stand rally tomorrow at Truett McConnell University in Cleveland, Georgia. What are you going to be telling people there as a little preview?
I'm pretty much going to be saying what I just said to your radio audience. Everything's on the line. This is for all the marbles. This is the first time in American history that control of the U.S. Senate has been decided in two U.S. Senate races on the same day in one state in a special election, in a runoff.
Ralph Reed, Faith and Freedom Coalition, thank you so much for joining us.